Hello, everyone. My name is Adalaine Holton. I'm a faculty member in the literature program. The title of my presentation is The Liberatory Power of Historical Recovery in Arna Bontemps' Black Thunder. First, I'd like to thank the students, faculty, staff, and community members attending the Day of Scholarship presentations. And I'd like to thank Jennifer Kozakowski in particular and the other organizers who made this event possible. My presentation focuses on Black Thunder, a novel written by Arna Bontemps, who's pictured here in the photo on the right. Before he published Black Thunder in 1936, Bontemps was known primarily as a poet, for which he received numerous awards and accolades during the Harlem Renaissance literary movement. Black Thunder is a historical novel depicting Gabriel's rebellion, a planned slave revolt led by an enslaved man named Gabriel in the year 1800 in Henrico County, Virginia. As Bontemps explains in the introduction he wrote to the 1968 edition of the novel, his interest in writing about what was then a little-known slave insurrection had emerged from his concern to address a complex set of political, social, and economic circumstances in the early 1930s, most notably the injustice of the Scottsboro trials. As Bontemps explains, he was drawn to write a novel about a slave insurrection not only because he wanted to fill gaps in historical knowledge, but also because he saw connections between these present-day concerns and the ways that enslaved people asserted their agency and risked their lives in their quest for freedom. While he was on a trip to Fisk University Library in the early 1930s, about 10 years before he was hired as Fisk's head librarian, Bontemps had an opportunity to research oral histories of formerly enslaved people collected by graduate students working under the direction of Charles S. Johnson. Impressed by what he called the stricken slave's will to freedom, he was determined to write a historical novel depicting a slave revolt. Of the three most significant attempted slave rebellions of the 19th century he considered writing about, those led by Gabriel, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner, Bontemps wrote that it was Gabriel's rebellion that seemed to represent, in his words, a more unmistakable equivalent of the yearning which I felt and which I imagined to be general. The conspirators who led Gabriel's rebellion developed an ambitious plan. They aimed to lead around 1,000 enslaved people and free Black people into Richmond, seize weapons from the armory, set fire to buildings, take Governor James Monroe hostage, and demand the end of slavery. The rebellion was thwarted, however, when two enslaved men betrayed their fellow conspirators to the authorities. Simultaneously, a heavy rainstorm prevented the conspirators from gathering. The conspiracy could not survive the double blows of the storm and the betrayals, and ultimately 72 Black men were tried for their role in the conspiracy, and 26 were found guilty and hanged, including Gabriel. Black Thunder was published during what Nathaniel Mills has called a watershed moment in Black historical scholarship. And the 1930s saw the publication of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, and C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, published in 1938, two works that Mills notes produced new accounts of Black political agency and challenged racist agendas of white historiographies. Like these works of historiography, Black Thunder counters 1930s assumptions about the history of New World slavery and calls into question the reliability of the archival materials upon which that history has been constructed. In preparing to write Black Thunder, Bontemps conducted extensive archival research, unearthing letters, speeches, court records, newspaper articles, and other materials related to Gabriel's rebellion and its context, as well as the oral histories of formerly enslaved people he researched at Fisk. As Eric Sundquist points out, the novel is in fact permeated by a circulation of historical texts related to the rebellion, including political pamphlets, scripture, laws, historical documents, conspiratorial talk, propaganda, and incendiary and incriminating letters. These historical texts are embedded within the novel's third-person omniscient narration, which Suzanne Lane points out often echoes the objectively distanced voice of a historian. Lane suggests, in fact, that the novel begins very much like a history text, commencing as it does with the following declaratory lines. Virginia court records for September 15, 1800, mention a certain Mr. Mosley Shepherd, who came quietly to the witness stand in Richmond and produced testimony that caused half the states to shudder. Archival sources are explicitly documented in similar ways throughout the novel. Rather than treating his sources as transparent windows onto the past, Bontemps calls attention to his sources as sources, thereby revealing the ways that written historical documents are constructed and preserved by motivated historical actors. As I argue, he shows how gaps, silences, and distortions make their way into official court records, letters, and other documents destined for the archive, long before the historians shaped those documents into narratives of historical knowledge. In other moments, Bontemps enters such gaps to envision the stories that the archive does not and may never yield. For example, while conspicuously documenting newspaper reports of the trials of Gabriel and other conspirators, Black Thunder simultaneously calls into question the reliability of newspapers and other printed texts. The novel's omniscient narrator noticed that in the aftermath of the rebellion, the nation's amazement flared as newspapers used the story to stoke fear of a widespread slave revolt in white readers, which were fanned by newspaper tales and swift rumors. All the while, Federalists sought to use the rebellion to sway the outcome of the upcoming presidential election between their candidate, John Quincy Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, by publishing editorials arguing that Jefferson may have emboldened the conspirators through what the narrator notes is an incautious and intemperate mention of the French principles of liberty and equality. While newspapers around the country reported the seriousness of the conspiracy, local Richmond papers, the narrator conveys, were engaged in a campaign of reticence and suggestion that the Salem Gazette ascribes to a mistaken notion of prudence and policy. Nonetheless, the narrator relates, reports about the conspiracy came through, and straight or warped, the newspapers printed and reprinted them. Newspaper accounts, the novel suggests, served to shape public memories of the conspiracy, but were themselves very much shaped by various competing agendas. Bontemps explores these vulnerabilities of writing in his portrait of the Richmond print shop run by Crusoe, a French immigrant suspected of encouraging the conspiracy. Crusoe's print shop offers a space for the exchange of philosophical and political ideas associated with the French Revolution. While standing outside the print shop weeks before the attempted rebellion, Gabriel overhears Alexander Bidenhurst, a Philadelphia abolitionist, discussing the French revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity with Crusoe. The words, Bontemps writes, put gooseflesh on Gabriel's arms and shoulders. For Gabriel, here were words for things that had been in his mind, things that he didn't know had names. While Crusoe and his associates engage in political and philosophical debates within the print shop, these ideas do not, however, appear to make their way into the documents they print and disseminate. Crusoe makes a living by printing pamphlets by local preachers, whom he says write like schoolboys and are generally as incoherent as they are dull. Not only are these pamphlets no credit to letters in the first place, as Crusoe complains, but the printing press proves vulnerable to silencing when local white boys destroy the print shop in the aftermath of Gabriel's attempted rebellion, when French immigrants are wrongly suspected of having fomented it. The unreliability and vulnerability of writing extends as well to handwritten missives, which are crucial to the plot of the rebellion and to the plot of the novel. While handwritten notes provide essential communication between conspirators and their sympathizers, they are prone to interception, thereby placing their bearers at risk. Melody, a free, literate Black woman who maintains connections with characters of different races and social backgrounds, uses handwritten notes to warn French Richmonders to leave town in advance of the planned rebellion. And when Gabriel and another leader of the conspiracy, General John, are on the run following the betrayal of the plot, Melody gives both men slips of paper on which she has written the address of Alexander Bidenhurst, the Philadelphia abolitionist friendly with the novel's French characters. When he is about to be captured, General John attempts to eat Melody's note in a scene reminiscent of the moment in Frederick Douglass's narrative, in which Douglass and his comrades are betrayed, and he instructs his friend Henry to eat his forged past with his biscuit. When armed guards grab the paper from General John's teeth, they expect to find a different type of handwritten note, a list of conspirators for which they've been searching unsuccessfully. Lists, if found, they imagine, would confirm suspected Jacobin involvement in the rebellion. Nonetheless, the paper with Bidenhurst's address seems to confirm their suspicion of outside involvement in the conspiracy. The officials who capture Gabriel search him for papers as well, tearing his clothes to ribbons in the process. Melody is never discovered to be the author of General John's note, and her role in the rebellion thus remains concealed from white authorities. Consequently, Melody and her story, the novel speculates, never make it into the historical record of Gabriel's rebellion. As scholars have pointed out, one of the most significant departures Bontemps makes from extant historical records is his inclusion of Gabriel's courtroom testimony. Virginia court records do not indicate that the historical Gabriel ever testified in court. However, in his 1889 account of Gabriel's rebellion, the abolitionist and author Thomas Wentworth Higginson raises the possibility that Gabriel may have testified, but that authorities found it good policy to omit his statement, whatever it was, thereby signaling that Gabriel's testimony was excised from the record in a calculated effort to contain his authority and thus the threat of future insurrections. Bontemps seizes upon Higginson's insinuation and invents a historically plausible courtroom exchange between Gabriel and the prosecutor. By restoring Gabriel's voice to the historical record, Bontemps imagines how Gabriel may have enacted a measure of control over his statements in court and at the scene of his execution, not only through his words, but also through strategic silences. When asked to implicate co-conspirators, for instance, Gabriel admits to his role in the rebellion, but refuses to implicate anyone not already in custody. When pressed by the prosecutor, Gabriel replies, "I ain't got cause to talk a heap, sir." And despite their heap of aggravating questions, Gabriel tells them just what it was good for them to know, and precious little more. The prosecutors in Gabriel's trial fixate on identifying white men who have inspired the conspiracy, asking if he was made the tool of foreign agitators, dubious that Gabriel could have conceived of the plan on his own. On this point, Gabriel is clear in his testimony before the court. He says, "I tell you, I've been studying about freedom a heap, me. I heard plenty of folks talk and I listened a heap, and everything I heard made me feel like I wanted to be free. It was on my mind hard, and it's right here the same way yet. Understand? That's all. Something keep telling me that anything what's equal to a gray squirrel wants to be free. That's how it all come about." Here, Gabriel testifies to the autonomy of the conspirators, emphasizing that the desire for freedom, a desire experienced by all living beings, originated with enslaved people themselves, not with the introduction of the ideals of the French Revolution. There are no records indicating that the historical Gabriel made any statement at his execution, nor is there a record of any verbal exchanges between the historical Gabriel and his executioners. Rather than fill this silence in the archive with an invented dialogue, as in the courtroom scene, Bontemps maintains Gabriel's silence, but represents it as a deliberate choice. In the novel's concluding moments, the executioner asks Gabriel if he would like to make a statement. Gabriel replies, "The rope, sir, let it talk," insisting that the executioners hear nothing but the sounds created by their own actions. And the rope does speak. It hums like a violin string after the sheriff's axe falls, thus serving as the final comment on Gabriel's conspiracy, trial, and execution. Then, one of the Black conspirators who betrays the rebellion happens to be passing by at the precise moment of Gabriel's execution and is horrified by what he witnesses. As Bontemps writes, even after Ben closes his eyes, he can see that arc of the axe and hear that violin string. Gabriel's silence during the scene of his own execution echoes other moments in the novel in which Gabriel and other conspirators elect to remain silent in their interactions with white officials. Silences within the written records of the conspiracy, Bontemps suggests, may not always be the product of erasure and distortion, but may be produced in part by strategic efforts of enslaved people to evade and confound the expectations of white authorities. Although Bontemps relies heavily on written historical documents in what was the very first full-length account of Gabriel's rebellion in history or in fiction, he simultaneously flags the untrustworthiness of written sources, especially court records and newspaper accounts. Bontemps reveals that returning to the archive may not be liberatory in and of itself, but returning to archival materials to uncover and imagine how these materials were created in the first place may, in fact, offer liberatory possibilities. Thank you, everyone, for attending my presentation. I've included my contact information on the slide. I welcome your comments and suggestions. Thanks again, everyone.